Hi everyone, my name is Chris and welcome to today's video. We're going to be restoring a pocket trumpet that I purchased off eBay for about £30. This is a Bessons Co pocket trumpet. It's about 20 years old based on what the seller told me. It's not in great shape, as you can see, and this is my second ever restoration project, so it's a pretty big one. The first one I did was quite an easy trumpet. It came in really good shape. This one is totally different, so let's break down exactly how we got to restoring this. So lots and lots of blemishes, lots of rust. It's not looking too good. The lacquer isn't looking great, lots of tarnish, but there it is, Bessons Co London pocket trumpet, and here's just a couple of nice shots of the tubing and all of that nasty tarnish. I don't even know what to call it. Is it rust? Is it tarnish? I was amazed when I got this out because the valves worked fine. They moved up and down of their own accord, but everything else was looking pretty nasty. So the first task was to take the trumpet apart. It didn't come with a mouthpiece, so I couldn't really play it to begin with. So I started by trying to get the valve caps off. The top ones didn't come off, but the bottom ones did, and I was very pleasantly surprised that the springs were at the bottom of the valve. That's not what I was expecting. I'd never come across this before. I have since, but yeah, first time I found the springs underneath the valves, so that was interesting. And there they are, not looking too bad at the moment. A little bit mouldy perhaps. I don't think this had ever been cleaned. So then there was the task of getting the tops off, and this was a lot more difficult than the bottom ones. I'm not sure if there was a bit of cross threading at the time. I was really worried when I got them off that I'd never get those caps back on again, but I did have to use a little bit of water displacement, WD-40, just to loosen them up. I wasn't too worried about any kind of lacquer or anything being damaged because I don't think there is any lacquer left on this instrument if it was ever lacquered in the first place. So that WD-40 did loosen up the middle cap. We were able to get that off and get our first look at the valve. Obviously the felt there is not looking too good, a little bit minging, a bit of nastiness on it. The other two really wouldn't budge, so I used a soft plastic tipped hammer and I just gently nudged at them to try and get them open, and that did open up. I think it's the third valve for us that did eventually come open. The other one took a lot more work. It was very, very difficult. It took me a good hour or so of fiddling with it, and eventually I did get it to loosen up off camera, but I didn't get the actual satisfying moment when it did open up, but I was very happy when it did. I was worried that that would stop me in my tracks very early on, but we were able to get all three of the caps off, all three of the valves safely out, and then we could obviously start having a look at that tubing. So there you go, we can have a quick look. There's our valves, very simple, just a bit of felt, the valve cap, and then of course the springs underneath, and then there's the inside. Not looking in too bad shape. I was worried there'd be a lot of mold in there. So the next challenge was to take off all of the slides, and this was pretty difficult to do as well. It took me a long time and a lot of fiddling around, using a lot of brute force as well. You can see there's a lot of gunk on there, a lot of dirt. I did have to use more WD-40 to really get in there and pull out the slides, but we did manage to get the two largest ones off, and then the other two were a little bit easier because we did have the little finger knob things that allow us to pull it out, so not too much force there, but as you can see I'm really having to tug there to get them out, but eventually we did manage to take the trumpet apart completely as far as we could. I did leave the water key on there. It looked absolutely fine, it was functioning okay, but funnily enough there was no hole for the water to come out. It looks like it's purely there for aesthetic purposes, so there's that. But here's all of our hardware, and of course the first thing we're going to do with a trumpet is just get it cleaned. So we're just filling up the bucket now so we can give it a soak in its entirety. I left all of the pieces in the soapy water, obviously excluding the felts and the bits that we don't want to get wet. I left it for a good hour to just soak using sort of lukewarm water. I really wanted to like get all of the dirt and all of the gunk sort of loosened up before I went for a proper scrub, so that's exactly what I'm doing here. And as you can see, my cat is giving me a hand. I didn't think he'd be interested in brass restoration, but it turns out he really enjoyed it, so yeah, it looks like I have a little companion for any future projects that I'll be working on. So just popping the valves in, and then I think I decided, after careful thought, there was no way I was getting the felt off the piston caps, so I decided to leave them out, and they're off to the side. And then finally in goes Mr. Trumpet, and yeah, as I said, that's going to soak for about an hour or so. Gave it a little turn just to make sure the water gets everywhere that I need it to. I mean, it would anyway, but perhaps I was being a bit impatient, who knows. And yeah, after about an hour or so, we take it out and start the cleaning process. Now, this was the start of many cleaning processes, particularly for the body of the Trumpet. I found I could scrub away at the removable tubing quite easily, but when it came to the actual Trumpet, getting that dirt off really was quite a challenge. So, you know, this is the first of many cleans, and I'm just getting the brush in there to really pull out any of the gunk that was in there. And you know, the brush, it's black, you can't really tell, it was very dirty. As I said, I don't think it had been cleaned in a very long time for a 20-year-old Trumpet. I think the seller told me it had been just in a shed for a very long time, so you know, all of that sort of, I don't know, condensation, all of that spit, all of that dirt just sort of sitting in there, it was really caked in. So I did this a couple of times for each piece of tubing to get the insides as cleared out as possible, before we could begin having a go at polishing the outside, which, as it turns out, was a very tricky thing to do. But there's all of our hardware nice and clean, and we're going to leave it there to dry off overnight. I think it took just over 24 hours or so for it to be completely dry. Obviously, every now and again I'd pick it up and give each piece a shake just to get all of the water out, but we wanted it to be nice and dry. Obviously, we want to avoid anything getting stuck in those tubes before we started the process of polishing everything. As you can see, the pieces of tubing there are still very dirty. So the soapy water didn't really do what I wanted it to, so we had Barkeeper's Friend, which is a metal polish, and I just really got to work with a toothbrush there. I tried my best to just get as much of the dirt off as possible, but also removing that sort of bronze tarnish that appeared all over the Trumpet. And it took a lot of scrubbing to get this off, and I mean a lot. I thought it was actually coloured metal to begin with. So once I started polishing the brass and I realised that sort of bronze purpley colour was coming away, I realised it was just really bad tarnish that had happened over time. And the good news is that it was removable, but the bad news for me is that it took a lot of scrubbing. I mean, this is just the first of many rounds of scrubbing, you know, with these pieces. And as you can see in the background there, we still have some really thickly set on dirt there that was, you know, probably the reason for the tubing having such difficulty coming out, because we really needed to get that off. And as you can see, I'm scraping it off with my nail there, just really trying to make the best of it. So in the end, I did decide to sort of give these another soak in some quite warm water in the sink there while we got to work polishing the outside of the Trumpet body. And this is largely just the same process, just applying that Barkeeper's Friend. You should never use this on a lacquered Trumpet, but as I said, there was no evidence of there being lacquer on this Trumpet. It looks to just be quite a matte brass finish, so in terms of, you know, worrying about any lacquer being peeled off, I didn't really need to worry about that. And as you can see, it is starting to, well, perhaps not at this stage yet. I think this is when it sets in and I realise, oh, this is going to be very hard work, because it was perhaps starting to shine up, but it wasn't looking quite as good as I wanted it to at this stage. I realised we're going to need to give it another go. So I filled a bucket with Barkeeper's Friend, swirled it around, and I decided to just soak the trumpet overnight. So that's what I did there. And in the meantime, I completely finished cleaning up all of the pieces, so all of the tubing is nice and clean, no more gunk on it, the valves are looking in much better shape. And then the next morning I finally took out the trumpet, and as you can see, it is already looking so much better for soaking overnight, which is absolutely great. So what I needed to do now was just really get to work polishing this thing down and just working off that lacquer. So I emptied the bucket of water, but I decided to use all of the residue at the bottom, and it really helped to just pull off that sort of bronze tarnish, and it really started to work away now. So I knew I had my hands full, I knew I had a lot of work to do, but as you can see on this piece of tubing here, after a little bit of a scrub, you start to see that golden colour coming through. So I really just sat there and scrubbed and scrubbed and scrubbed, and eventually it started to look a bit more like a monocolour trumpet, and it started to look a bit more gold, a bit more shiny, and I was so relieved to see that coming off, because I really didn't think it was going to happen. The only bad news about that is as the pieces get more and more shiny, the mould and the rust sort of became a bit more pronounced, and we'll see that a bit later on. But overall, I'm so happy with how this turned out. I think it looks absolutely great. So yeah, it's just I think it turned out really nicely, and you'll see that very shortly. I mean, I was just, as I say, scrubbing away and working away at that sort of bronze colour. And yeah, if you compare to earlier when I was showing you Bessons Co logo, it looks so much better now. And there was a lot of residue stuck just in the pieces, you know, really deep in the cracks and also in the valve casing. So I just got that toothbrush in there, which is now absolutely filthy, and I just pulled all of the powder out. I didn't want any of it leaving in there, and then we just gave it a full rinse down to get all of that out of there. But as you can see, after a lot of work and a lot of scrubbing, it is looking much nicer now. It's looking very golden, very shiny, and I'm just really pleased with how it all turned out. So let's give it a shake down, and then we leave it to dry again. Oh, but not before we give it another scrub. A lot of this was just residue, but I was surprised to see still some dirt coming out of there. I imagine, you know, there could well be more dirt still anyway. So I did another full clean of the tubing and of the valves. I think I got most of it out this time round, as well as any residue, which was great. And then we leave it to dry, and I laid out all of the pieces, everything that we'd need to reassemble our trumpet, and just let it all dry off before we get to actually reassembling it, which was actually quite a job in itself as well. Almost as difficult, well, not quite, but quite difficult to reassemble everything. So sort of did it the way that we started. I put the bottoms of the valve caps on, and despite my worries about there being cross-threading, you know, valve number 1 was quite difficult, but we did manage to get them all on in the long term. And then I reassembled the valves, gave them a lot of valve oil both in the casings and on the valve itself, and then I just sort of worked it in, made sure everything was in full working order. And you know, it was very stiff to begin with, but after a bit of work it did really start to loosen up, which was nice. And you know, it worked absolutely perfectly in the end. So yeah, as you can see, a bit sticky as we're just working in that valve oil, but after a little bit of playing with it, it did really loosen up. And as you can see there, quite a nice shot of the second valve working nicely now. So then I just reassembled the other 2 valves and popped them in, and you know, as I said, just worked it in, made sure that there was no sticking, and that everything worked nicely. I think perhaps in the long term I could replace the springs because they aren't quite as responsive as I would like, but you know, it works perfectly well now considering. So we pop the last valve in and tighten it up, and there it is, all three of them back on there. I have no idea if I put the same three back on the same three valve casings, who knows, but everything's working fine. And then obviously applied valve oil to the tubes as well to make sure they don't lock up anywhere near as much, so make sure they slide in nicely. The second valve tube there, that one went in nicely. The smaller tubes went in actually really well. They are a bit stiff. I wouldn't recommend sort of trying to use them for tuning by any means, but you know, everything worked out okay. I did find a new mouthpiece, but it does not fit a normal mouthpiece for some reason, so I decided to shorten the mouthpiece using a hacksaw, which is perhaps not the most conventional thing to do. There's my cat helping me hack a mouthpiece down. So I did some sanding on 3 different grades, just working it down, and then I smoothed out the edges just so it wasn't quite as sharp. Not that that particularly mattered, and then it did end up fitting into the trumpet much nicer. And so yeah, it doesn't quite play exactly like a standard pocket trumpet, which would be in B flat, but there it is, the finished trumpet. So there it is, you can see it turned out really well. It plays, it functions perfectly, and it's now a very shiny looking trumpet. There it is when we started, and here it is at the end. I think it turned out perfect. Thanks so much for watching, guys. See you later.